Before Roosevelt Island became a quiet stretch of apartments and parks, it was known by another name, Blackwell's Island, and 100 years ago it wasn't a place anyone wanted to visit. It was where New York sent the people it didn't want to see: the poor, the sick, the criminal, and the insane. On paper, the asylum on Blackwell's Island was supposed to be a modern medical facility, a place of care and compassion. In reality, it became one of the darkest institutions in New York's history. Behind its stone walls, patients weren't treated. They were tortured. It all began in the mid-1800s, when New York was growing faster than it could manage. Immigration, poverty, and disease filled the city with people who had nowhere to go. The city's almshouse on Blackwell's Island was already overcrowded, so officials decided to build a separate institution for those considered mentally ill. In 1839, the New York City Lunatic Asylum opened its doors. It was meant to be a symbol of progress, humane treatment for people society once locked in cages. But as with many of the city's early institutions, that promise didn't last long. By the 1860s, the asylum had turned into something else entirely. It was overcrowded, understaffed, and unregulated. Doctors rarely visited. Attendants were untrained, many of them hired off the street for low pay. The city sent anyone who couldn't function in public, women suffering from trauma, immigrants who didn't speak English, even the homeless, all labeled as insane. And once you were inside, there was no way out. Patients described freezing rooms in the winter and sweltering ones in summer. Meals were thin broth, spoiled meat, and black bread crawling with insects. Many people weren't allowed to lie in real beds. They slept on straw on the floor or directly on stone. Beatings were common. Attendants used leather straps, ropes, and sticks to keep order. Women who screamed were locked in isolation cells or thrown into freezing baths. Those who resisted were tied to chairs for hours, sometimes days. The asylum wasn't hidden. It sat right across the East River, visible from Manhattan. But to most New Yorkers, it may as well have been another world. Out of sight meant out of mind. That changed in 1887, when a young journalist named Nellie Bly decided to find out what really went on behind those walls. At the time, Bly was just 23 years old, working for the New York World. She proposed something unheard of: to fake insanity, get herself committed to the asylum, and write what she saw. Her editors agreed. She checked herself into a women's boarding house, started acting confused and paranoid, and within days, police arrested her as a lunatic. Doctors quickly declared her insane. She was shipped off to Blackwell's Island with no trial, no further questions. What she found there would shock the nation. Bly spent 10 days inside the asylum, and what she described in her book, 10 Days in a Madhouse, remains one of the most disturbing accounts in New York's history. She wrote of women sitting motionless for hours, forced to stare at walls. She saw patients beaten for crying, starved for talking, and doused in ice water for disobedience. One woman was foreign-born and didn't speak English. Doctors assumed she was insane simply because she couldn't understand questions. Another was poor and sick, not mentally ill, but had been dropped off by police because there was nowhere else for her to go. The asylum was less a hospital and more a warehouse for human misery. Bly wrote about the nurses, many of whom were cruel or apathetic, laughing as patients shivered in thin dresses during the cold nights. She wrote about rotten food crawling with vermin, and about women being forced to take baths in the same filthy water used for others. Perhaps the most horrifying part was how easy it was to get in, and how impossible it was to get out. Once labeled insane, anything you said was seen as proof of madness. When Bly told doctors she was sane, they said that was part of her delusion. After 10 days, her newspaper arranged her release. When her report was published, it caused a national uproar. For the first time, Americans saw how their city treated its most vulnerable. Her investigation led to a grand jury probe, and eventually, funding increases and reforms for mental institutions across New York. But while conditions improved slightly, the island's reputation never recovered. Through the early 1900s, new hospitals, workhouses, and prisons opened there. It became a dumping ground for people the city didn't want on the mainland: alcoholics, tuberculosis patients, the poor, and those with mental illness. The asylum's overcrowding grew even worse. Records from the early 20th century show the asylum, designed for a few hundred people, was housing more than 1,500 at one point. Sanitation was almost non-existent, diseases spread quickly, and despite Bly's expose, cruelty continued. Only now it was hidden behind medical language and bureaucratic indifference. Patients were experimented on with cold baths, shock therapy, and forced isolation. Some doctors used what they called moral treatments, starvation diets, or forced labor, and when patients died, their bodies were quietly buried in unmarked graves on the island. In the 1930s, the city tried to move patients off Blackwell's Island to a new facility at Ward's Island, but by then, the damage was done. The asylum had become a symbol of everything wrong with early mental health care: neglect, abuse, and the idea that the poor could be locked away simply for being inconvenient. By the mid-20th century, Blackwell's Island was renamed Roosevelt Island. The old asylum buildings were either demolished or repurposed, but one structure still stands today: the Octagon, the building that once served as the main entrance to the asylum. It's now the lobby of a luxury apartment complex, its walls cleaned and polished. Few who pass through it realize they're walking on the same ground where thousands of forgotten patients once suffered. If you visit Roosevelt Island now, it feels peaceful. Families walking along the waterfront, views of Manhattan across the river. But under that calm surface lies a buried history. For over a century, Blackwell's Island represented the city's belief that you could hide your problems across the water, that you could build walls around pain and call it progress. The asylum story isn't just about one building. It's about how society defines sanity and worth. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, many of the women confined there weren't crazy at all. They were simply poor, foreign, or outspoken. Some had postpartum depression, others trauma. Some were committed by husbands or family members who wanted them out of the way. And once the label of insane was stamped on their records, it followed them forever. The horror of Blackwell's Island was that it wasn't filled with monsters. It was filled with ordinary people trapped in a system that didn't see them as human. When Nellie Bly's reports reached the public, people called her a hero, and she was. But even she admitted that nothing she wrote could capture the full horror of what she saw. Her work led to some reforms, yes, but the deeper truth remained. The city's institutions were built more to contain than to heal. Today, historians and preservationists still study the asylum's ruins, trying to piece together its lost records. Many files were destroyed long ago. The names of countless patients are gone. Their stories exist only in fragments, letters, brief mentions in newspapers, or in Nellie Bly's pages. If you stand on the north end of Roosevelt Island today, you can still see the faint outline of the old foundation. Wind rushes through the trees where the asylum once stood, and the East River laps quietly at the shore. It's hard to imagine the screams that once echoed across that water, but the legacy of Blackwell's Island never really left New York. It's a reminder of how easy it is for a city to hide its pain behind progress, and how quickly compassion can turn into cruelty when no one is watching. What happened on that island wasn't an accident. It was the result of a system that valued order over empathy, reputation over truth, and the people who suffered there, the forgotten men and women who were locked away and silenced, were victims not of madness, but of neglect. The asylum on Blackwell's Island may be gone, but its shadow still lingers. Every time New York builds something new, it buries another piece of its past. But history has a way of resurfacing, and the truth about that island and what was done there will always find its way back to the surface, because the city that never sleeps has ghosts, and some of them still whisper from across the river.